The other I know to have been in my family is my great-grandmother's sister, Elín Sigurðardóttir Hall, who left for Canada from Skagafjörður in 1900, was a laundress in Winnipeg in 1901, and registered as a seamstress in 1916. She never married and did not have children and passed away in 1960 in Winnipeg. My dear Aunt Elín is named after her and has been to Winnipeg to seek her namesake's history. Now, I want to thank PJ, Kat, and Karen for, as well as the programs of Icelandic Studies and Indigenous Studies for bringing me all the way over here. When I was interviewing for my position at the university here, I was literally in Winnipeg, and I was walking around the university looking for the people in the department, learning that they were all in Reykjavik. So I wrote to them and said, oh, luckily we do overlap for one day on a Sunday, and they invited me to an amazing dinner in Reykjavik, and we had a great time. And they told me about this event, and they gave me kind of a soft mention of maybe being able to come over for this. And this was very convenient because I can also come back to Winnipeg to prepare my move in January. And I was very moved by what LK described as real estate speculation being a feature of everyday life. And I identified with the embarrassment of talking about money and doing exactly this. I'm going around apartment shopping these days, and I had a really nice sit down yesterday with a Winnipeg Icelander who'd like to rent me a room in her apartment, potentially. Of course, I would not have benefited from her kindness if I had not been an Icelander, and we spoke at length about Icelandic history in Winnipeg. And you know what? We still haven't spoken about money, but ultimately that moment will come. It's that embarrassing moment. I'm afraid of lowballing her. She's afraid of overcharging me, and both of us are afraid of being ripped off. Both of us have particular needs, otherwise we would not have been brought together. I also wanted to thank Nelson and Sölmundur for the tremendous presentations so far. So after acknowledging LK's, I hope that you can come to see some of what I talk about in the light of Nelson's beautiful presentation, because there's a danger when we start looking at settler indigenous relations, and I'm noticing this with myself, that we can overcorrect. We can overlook the important lessons of co-creation and common humanity that I also want to acknowledge. So if I am somewhat guilty of this, I apologize in advance. What I'm going to present will be very familiar to many of you, but I hope that you can also see it through my eyes as a kind of an intellectual biography of an Icelandic scholar coming to terms with the history of Icelanders in North America. Now,
you should be able to use the clicker to advance.
The clicker, yes. Any button, okay.
I think the right-hand button.
Yeah.
Right-hand button. Yes. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
An oversized Viking statue emerges from the lake, holding a horn in one hand and a halberd in another. The burly figure sports a substantial beard, long snaking hair, and bushy eyebrows. His dress is stereotypical Viking, a cloak, leg wraps, and that faux signifier of Vikingness, a horned helmet. The statue is in the Viking garden of the rural municipality of Gimli on Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada. When I visited the garden on a trip to Gimli in the summer of 2025, the Viking sported an academic cap on his head in a nod to graduation week in Manitoba universities, indicating the playful cohabitation of Gimli's residents with their Nordic heritage. This was my third time in Canada. The first time I drove a delivery van from New York to Toronto to deliver an architectural model for a competition. I was in and out of the city in 2 days. My colleague, pictured there, and I admired Mies van der Rohe's Toronto Dominion Centre and did not give the city and its history a second thought. When I visited Toronto for the second time in 2018 as a PhD candidate in architectural history at Columbia University, presenting a paper at a translation studies conference at York University in Toronto, I had a dissimilar experience. This time, Canadian Indigenous peoples and their experiences were much more palpable. Had I changed? I was now a PhD student trained to be attentive to injustices perpetuated through space in a way my mid-aughts undergraduate self was not? Or were the circumstances of my visit more conducive to such an experience? A conference with the title of, quote, Translation and Decolonization, unquote, would be remiss not to address Canadian settler colonialism by foregrounding Indigenous scholars. Its program featuring Indigenous poets during breaks dazzled an aloof architect turned scholar who had arrived in Toronto to deliver a paper about architecture at the UN headquarters. Or was the difference caused by Canada having, in the interim, gone through Truth and Reconciliation? The Commission had published its report in 2015. Anthropologist Glenn Sean Coulthard criticized the Commission's colonial politics of recognition, where the Canadian government policy recognized and historicized selective aspects of settler colonialism, the residential schools, without acknowledging it as an ongoing process. Even my search for Winnipeg real estate. Most striking in this second trip, however, was the ubiquity of land acknowledgement statements. I had never even heard one at my US university as late as that time, 2018. They're ubiquitous now. And I scrambled to produce one before my talk. Might my native Iceland one day become the only place where one does not offer such a statement? Because there is no record of humans living there until Norwegians populated the island in the year 870 AD, Hapar notwithstanding? Or might the scholars of the future acknowledge the Arctic fox, the only indigenous land mammals? Then I had a flash of insight, and this is embarrassingly late. Icelanders had participated in the displacement of indigenous peoples. In the fourth quarter of the 19th century, a quarter of the population, as we all know, moved to America, with the largest portion of them settling in New Iceland, a reserve on Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. Icelandic children learn about New Iceland in history classes. In these comforting histories, the plucky settlers had been exploited subjects of the Danish Empire until they took matters in their own hands. Overpopulation, decades of cold weather, and a volcanic eruption led them to emigrate to North America, like so many other Northern Europeans in those years. When I got back to New York, I sought out Ryan Aford's White Settler Reserve, confirming my insight. Aford tells the story of Icelandic migration from the point of view of the Canadian government and how it led to the establishment of New Iceland on the banks of Lake Winnipeg. This story is, of course, too well known for me to rehearse it here. Canada, integrated the Icelandic Reserve, like other national reserves, into the Dominion Lands Act as an exception, a colonization reserve of a distinct ethnic group within a broader policy of individual homesteading. Canadian authorities drew up a plan of a proposed village, a plan proposed for an Icelandic village in November 1875, representing what would become the town of Gimli. As the Icelanders were arriving, Canadian settlers were still at work, leading the Icelanders to adapt only loosely to the plan. Nonetheless, the plan and its identification as a founding document for the town of Gimli represents an early architectural manifestation of New Iceland, while its ready incorporation into the wider Dominion land system is a critical moment in the settlers' acquiescence in settler colonialism in Canada. Through the proposed plan, architecture and settler colonialism interlock. And incredibly, it may even be the oldest even though it's maybe not necessarily an architectural plan, it is a kind of an architectural artifact, and it may actually be the oldest plan of an Icelandic village in total, because at this time, as we know, there were hardly Icelandic villages either. And this is perhaps, Aford shows that the Icelanders, being white, Nordic, and Protestant, made them ideal settlers in the eyes of Canadian authorities to settle in the Northwest Territories. Never mind that they had little in common with conditions in Iceland. More importantly, he shows that the Icelanders did not encounter an empty land ripe for colonization, but one inhabited by indigenous people, which they had proceeded to appropriate since the Canadian government had promised it to them. After a year of tense cohabitation with indigenous inhabitants, the smallpox epidemic brought on by the traveling settlers who had limited resistance, decimated the indigenous population. The Canadian government then went on to further eradicate their settlements as matters of combating smallpox, including the burning of indigenous dwellings, whereas the Icelanders did not receive such draconian treatment. Popular histories have until recently downplayed these colonial encounters, at least on the Icelandic side. They have reduced the indigenous population to the figure of John Ramsay, remembered for his gracious treatment of and coexistence with the settlers, so movingly told by Nelson just now. By ossifying Icelandic indigenous relations into a handful of feel-good stories, they glossed over the Icelanders' appropriation of indigenous lands, not least by eradicating them by carrying smallpox onto them. Ayford's book appeared on the heels of the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's report in 2015. It was the first critical history of the Icelandic community in Canada, in Manitoba's relations with Indigenous people. By 2020, the political climate had hardened. Under quarantine because of COVID-19, North America, including Canada, was in the throes of the Black Lives Matter movement, combined with calls to defund the police. In this atmosphere of radical reassessment of race relations in North America and beyond, activists in Montreal toppled the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, widely seen as responsible for the residential school system. It was the final blow to the statue, only one of a series of frequently defaced statues of Macdonald across Canada. It has and will not be replaced. The Viking of Gimli has not suffered the same fate as Macdonald. Instead, he has been lovingly restored in 2015 and embellished with a surrounding Viking park in 2017. However, the first scholarly treatment of the statue and the park by Icelandicist Andrew McGillivray, who's actually here today, comments brilliantly on this unfortunate symbolism in light of changed perceptions of the relationship between the Canadian government, European settlers, and the Indigenous peoples of Canada. The statue was originally designed by Gissur Eliasson of the University of Manitoba's School of Art and was constructed by an Italian immigrant to Manitoba, George Barone, who became famous for his large fiberglass sculptures for sites throughout Canada. A stone plaque from the statue's unveiling in 1967 by President of Iceland, Óskar Óskarsson, commemorates Vikings, discoverers of America 1000 AD. In addition to this discovery of America, the statue can be seen as also commemorating the Norwegian settlement of Iceland. In the settler colonialist context of Gimli, however, McGillivray shows that Viking imagery takes on a more pernicious meaning. Two statues commemorate these prior landings in Reykjavik. Einar Jónsson's statue of Ingólfur Arnórsson, the first successful Icelandic settler from 1924 on Arnarhóll, and Sturling Calder's statue of Leifur Eiríksson from 1932, the explorer remembered as having been the first European to set foot on continental America. Both of these point west towards the ocean. Ingólfur leans on his ship's dragonhead prow, whereas Leifur's stone pedestal is a streamlined modern abstraction of a ship's prow. Their orientations, along with their maritime props, lend them an air of mobility. The main difference is that Ingólfur stands still and looks serenely from his dragonhead prow towards the land he is about to set foot on. Leifur, on the other hand, is in motion. He steps off the prow onto the continent. The Viking in Gimli represents the next step, literally. His ship is nowhere in sight. Instead, he walks from the water, Lake Winnipeg in this instance, and onto the land as he plants his foot, along with his halberd, on a fiberglass rock. Although he faces west like the others, his location in America now gives his orientation a different meaning. He's left his ship behind, on Lake Winnipeg as it were, and claimed its banks. One gets the impression that he will soon claim more. In 1967, Canada was decades away from reckoning with its treatment of Indigenous peoples. The Viking imagery was a product of ignorance. In the decades since, more is known both about Vikings and their dress, and the settler colonial displacement of indigenous people, including by the Icelanders. The Gimli Viking statue has become a pernicious satire of 1967 era representations of Nordic culture. The only way to live with it, instead of vandalizing and downright toppling it, as protesters have done to MacDonald statues, is to make irreverent fun of it of the sort that the graduation cap represents. The Viking statue is flawed and ridiculous, and its only chance for survival is for the public to celebrate it as such while acknowledging its troubling symbolism. Unfortunately, such acknowledgements were not forthcoming during the Viking statue's restoration, nor during the commissioning and construction of the Viking Park as completed in 2017 and designed by Winnipeg landscape architecture firm HTFC Planning and Design. The park, otherwise tastefully done, leans further into representations of Icelandic myths. An elf garden includes lowbrow representations of elf houses, miniature turf house facades sometimes featured in Icelanders' gardens, for example, in my grandparents' summer house in Grímsnes. And then a troll garden features faces carved into stones to represent how trolls turned into stone when exposed to the light of day. Perhaps these elements are meant to deflect from the ominous idea of a Viking park on the banks of Lake Winnipeg. But the fact that HTFC does not list the project on its website is telling. If their design is lighthearted, they seem not to be overly enthusiastic about being recognized as the one telling it. After all, the firm acknowledges on its website that its Winnipeg office is steps away from the Red River within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Iniju, Ojibwe, and Dakota peoples in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and that their, quote, projects and partnerships extend to the territories and treaty areas of other Indigenous peoples across Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories and beyond, unquote. As McGillivray points out, however, the Viking Garden plaque does not acknowledge the exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the area at the time of settlement, but instead frames colonization within the narrow context of negotiation and contact, unquote. A recent flare-up exposes a guilty common sentiment oozing under the statue's renovated but already cracking skin. In a post in the Facebook community, Meanwhile in Gimli, a community member posted, "Has there ever been discussion about removing the horns from the Viking statue? It's kind of embarrassing." The post set off a firestorm in the community, leading to national attention, with the executive director of the new Iceland Heritage Museum in Gimli telling CTV News that, quote, "There has never been a Viking helmet found with horns." The Facebook author concluded his participation on Meanwhile in Gimli by apologizing for having asked. The angry comments gathered their power from the backlash to the protest movements of 2020 to 21. One of their results was the toppling of statues thought by some to represent white supremacy and violence towards Indigenous peoples. McGillivray's article, written in the protest's aftermath, did not use such language, but one could certainly imagine someone using such language to describe the ideology of the Viking statue. McGillivray points out that Eliasson did not originally conceive of the Viking with horns. The Gimli Chamber of Commerce, who commissioned the statue, had ordered a large number of plastic helmets with horns, insisting that the helmet be changed to match the dominant Viking aesthetic of the time. Regardless, the horns are a red herring. The community member may, in all earnestness, have been calling for a more historically accurate depiction, not realizing that he was conscripting himself to one side of the culture wars. Judging from the reaction, hundreds of angry commenters on the other side, many of whom are likely descendants of New Icelanders, or may well be at least, collectively realized that making an innocent change to the costume would open the statue up to a host of other, more serious questions, the most important one perhaps being whether Gimli should have a Viking statue at all. Thank you very much.
All right. All right. And once again, if there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to offer. Yes, LK, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Really beautiful. You're a wonderful photographer as well. You really shouldn't have mentioned the horns on the helmet because that's such a can of worms. But there is actually a nice sentiment. I can't remember who said it, that when Icelanders stop fighting about things in Canada, it will mean that our culture is dead. So I think the horn is a good kind of like line on like our heart. So I've read that, and Sonia Lundström is here, and she might know better about the Swedish connection, that the horn helmet mistake comes from this image that was found in 1870 when horn helmets took off in Sweden, and that it's actually Odin. It was a Neolithic depiction of Odin with the horns. And so I would maybe, sorry, I'm doing it's more of a comment than a question. I would argue that it's possible that this is actually, in a way, accurate.
Yeah.
Because it is a reflection of the 1870s and how people thought about like that world and that history. And that there is a horn helmet depiction, you know, from like much longer ago than Iceland had people on it. But yeah, I don't know if you've ever heard of that reference to these like Torslanda plates with like the horn helmet.
Yes, yes. I didn't do the deep dive on the kind of the historiography of the horned helmets. And I know that, you know, these it's a subject that has been, you know, thoroughly expounded on elsewhere. So I guess I realized I kind of, you know, so I have to acknowledge that that's why what I mean that this is kind of like an intellectual biography. So I'm kind of stepping into this world of people that have already been talking about this for a long time. And I had this, for example, at first I had this idea that I was going to compare, you know, a turf house in, you know, somewhere in Isla with a turf house, you know, with the beginnings of a building here. And that would be a really interesting architectural observation. And then I realized that this was the idea that Augusta Maxwell had and actually performed this study. So then I was like, okay, so what do we do now? And then I start thinking, okay, the Viking. How about I do the Viking? I look at the Viking, and then I come home. I'm taking all these great photographs. I'm starting to write my article, and then I, of course, come across Andy's amazing article. He's already written it, so that's why I figured I should just kind of maybe I could just rehearse this a little bit, you know, and kind of open myself up precisely to a host of, you know, being guilty of all my preconceptions, and write because in the end, it actually became an article for something called the Nordic Review of Architecture, and it's about to come out soon. And, you know, because I thought it, you know, even though it wasn't the perfect article maybe, or wasn't the most scholarly, sophisticated, at least it would help Nordic people kind of reckon with their own histories, not the least because they're really going through the relationships between Scandinavians and Sami people in northern Scandinavia, and it has such resonances with the Canadian story, obviously the Danish interactions with people in Greenland. So that this would somehow be a great fit for this review as a kind of a Nordic history. Nordic architectural history. So that's why I felt it just, and Andy was very kind to he's here, by the way, he's back, and he was very kind to agree that it was worth publishing, even though it was somehow perhaps already, you know, not the most original observations. Yeah. Any other questions?
Anyone else?
I'm gonna put my neck on the chopping block. As I prepare for my last year of service as editor of Bloomberg Newsweek, during which I'm gonna write all the stories I've been afraid to write. The previous 11. I just want to say how much I appreciate your observation. In some ways, you know, when I look at the Viking statue or at Paul Bunyan down in Bemidji, Minnesota, I see a caricature, and I have to acknowledge I knew the fiberglass artist who did this.
You knew them personally.
Piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in passing, And so I appreciate his craftsmanship. But this is one step away from going full plastic with our heritage. So just kind of the very medium and the oversizedness of it. It is a bit of a caricature, and I've never understood the affection for it, except among children. I mean, I understand children marveling at the Viking statue. But it has always seemed more like a lampoon of our heritage. You know, when you compare it to Einar Jonsson's sculpture on the grounds of the legislature, or the magnificent sculpture of Sigtryggur Jónsson at Riverton, which you know honors a historic figure and their contributions, and takes art and architecture seriously. So I just want to express how liberated I feel.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, but I hope I'm not, I do not want, I also appreciate that I'm not denigrating the artist, you know, I have to,
I
you
understand,
know,
yeah.
because it is a kind of an ingenious experiment,
It-
and
It really it was classic 1967.
yes.
I mean, it is a monument to its time.
Yes, and also that it belongs to a network of other kind of almost caricatures, you know, that I showed her.
But
You know,
But now I'm thinking of my fiberglass canoe. Over and against birch bark originals, or canvas and wood strip originals, and wondering if I actually need to convert myself.
right.
Andy, you have a question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan, and thank you, Óskar. We probably kind of new to my comment, it's okay having the Johnson statue on the legislative grounds, but it's also the term of the all thing. And then, Amy Johnson was mentioned here. You had an image, I believe, the statue of Johnny McDonald that's been toppled in Montreal. I have a piece coming out next year about the Einar Jónsson that was toppled in Philadelphia. And I think it was in 2018 or 2019 that Thorstein Falsetti. And I believe it's still in storage in Philadelphia. There was a white supremacist gang that would gather at this statue yearly to mark the Harrison Day. And then activists, counter-activists, toppled it. And they received red paint different times leading up to that. So in a way that what the Einar Jónsson piece has brought the Icelandic community in North America into the toppling statue conversation.
I had no idea. That's
So now the Einar Jónsson on the ledge grounds, as far as I know, is the only publicly accessible Einar Jónsson in North America that I know of.
Yes. I incidentally work in the Einar Jónsson, you know, the museum, Einar Jónsson Museum. So the original for the Thorfinn Katsnefni is in the museum. So I look at it.
And then there is one object still standing in relation.
Yeah.
You know, the movie theater.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out.
All right, are there any other questions or comments or catharsis? Yes?
I can step in, like, I guess if you look closely, like the proportions are wrong, but his leg is too long. And I might not really straight.
I didn't think.
It's not.
Interesting.
I didn't think about that. Yeah,
Probably not the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. Maybe his feet are not the same length. Yeah, that's true.
Okay,
I have a quick question, so about this, I think again, coming back to the importance of critical study, the importance of this department. Because is this being appropriated by white supremacists, right? Like this history. And I had heard that in Iceland, there's a pushback against these kinds of like pro-colonial sculptures. And I heard about a contemporary artist that like shot one of them, shot one of the first white mother of North America sculptures into the sky. Have you heard about this?
Well, they shot it into the sky. At least they abducted her.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if she's been replaced now. The sculpture's been replaced, I think. Fairly prominent Icelandic artist, so it was kind of the first example of this type of activity there. But it's not like this, they're not being celebrated by white supremacists, let's say. I mean, unless you see all of this kind of celebration as a kind of a celebration of white supremacy, but they're not being, it's rather the opposite, and that's that's a little bit what I'm maybe trying to say here today as well, is that there is a kind of a backlash effect, or we can overdo it almost, where you actually create more problems than you might, I guess that's one of the implications, that by doing that, you create a whole cauldron of dissatisfied people that might not sympathize with, destroying a sculpture, although, the gesture itself may be, I agree with the criticism, but there's a lot of people that will not agree with the vandalism thing.
Yes, and
Just an aside, growing up with that statue, I grew up just north of Gimli. And yes, we knew it was not historically accurate or anything, but it was just always there and kind of fun, and nobody took it real serious. And you always had to go, if somebody came, they had to get their picture with the Viking statue. But it was never, at least in my viewpoint and in my family's, I would have to say, nobody took it too seriously. It was just fun, not, totally different, but not any different than, Happy Rock in Gladstone, and there's a turkey somewhere, and I think Marno has a mosquito, and, it kind of along those lines. So, yeah.
Yes, so there is a way one can almost kind of overdo it, or kind of judge this by the standards of.
Yes, I don't see this as being in the same category as historic statues. If you would, whatever that.
Yeah, I might push back a little bit because of the Viking imagery and what that kind of carries with it, so that would be like the counter, if it was just something that was completely disconnected to, violent histories, at a violent, arguably violent spot, then the criticism would be taken, but I have to push back a little bit, or at least that's what gives us concern.
Yes, yes, I do hear that. I just, yeah. And also.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate that, very much, yeah.
And when you're younger and then you get older, you realize a lot of these things.
Yes.
That when you're younger,
Of course, yeah.
yeah, it's just not even.
Part of that.
Yeah.
Whatever the landscape.
all right, well, if there aren't any other questions or comments, then I think we can move to our lunch break. So we have an hour, I think, for lunch, or 45. Not quite, I think we're supposed to be back at 11 or 12:30. 12:30 is when we're reconvening, so you have just over 45 minutes for lunch. There are refreshments served over here, so please go and help yourselves and